I'm Rob Moore.
And I'm Lee Moore.
This is a Chinese literature podcast.
So today we're looking at a poet that you know quite a bit about. We've done something on him. He has already graced the podcast.
Once,
the poet's
yes.
name is Haizi.
Haizi is by far the most beloved contemporary Chinese. By contemporary, I mean after 1976.
I would say after 49, really, because there's no one from 49 to
no one reads any of the poetry during the Maoist era.
No one
but
reads
still,
that crap.
Within the sort of Chinese literary dating schematic.
Yeah.
Post-cultural revolution is the contemporary. Haizi is not just one of these poets that everyone writes about in China, but everyone reads in China.
Yeah.
And he has this kind of mystical, almost following. A friend of ours talks about sitting in her dorm with her friends at night in China, reading his poetry by candlelight. That kind of poet. No one does that. No one does that with, Xu Zhimo or somebody like that.
No.
And the poem we're talking about today is by far his most well-known poem.
If you mention this poem to pretty much anyone who's graduated from high school in the last 20 years in China, they will have read this poem.
Everyone knows this poem. It's in all the textbooks. You mention Haizi, even if they're like, they don't really know that much about him, they will know this poem. There could be a lot of reasons for that. But just before we were doing the podcast, Lee and I were talking about the fact that it's very hard sometimes to talk about Haizi's poetry purely as poetry.
Mm-hmm.
His life and sort of stature in China it overwhelms a lot of times what he actually wrote. Because not all of it's good. If you read as much of his collected works as you can, there's a lot of, frankly,
crap.
Yeah. And we talked about this on another podcast, that no one, for example, reads or talks about his long poems, his epic works, while they're inferior to his short works. You'll often hear, okay, fine, but then that's awfully tricky to call someone a wonderful example of contemporary poetry if a quarter of his output is garbage.
Yeah.
Anyway, but this poem, everyone agrees, is a classic.
And what's the name of it?
The name in Chinese is 面朝大海,春暖花开.
So, facing the ocean.
The warm spring, the flowers in bloom.
Yeah.
That sort of thing. The image itself obviously conjures up examples from classical poetry. The idea of the ocean and the spring and sort of these primal forces. They're all over classical poetry, especially Tang poetry. There's even... I don't think it's exactly the same. No, I don't think it's not the same language. But that famous Li Bai poem about looking up and facing the moon has this similar sort of wistful quality to it.
So let's just go ahead and jump into the poem.
We're going to talk about a couple of different lines that we find, not just me, but that we find interesting for various reasons. It should also be an interesting introduction to why Haizi is so well beloved, I guess.
Why is he so beloved?
Partly because, I think, of his age. He killed himself when he was 25 in 1989. And we talked about this on the other podcast that we did of him. But he kills himself just before, I think a month or two before, the June 4th Tiananmen Square massacre.
Yeah.
So his death, it's a little bit like the way people from the 60s viewed John Lennon's death. Like, that was sort of the end of that era, because the Beatles were basically, they represented so much to so many people. The interesting thing being that Haizi dies before he really has any following at all. He's very much an Emily Dickinson sort of character where, frankly, most people didn't read his poetry. They didn't know it existed.
And Ray Wang Kunze, a friend of mine, who's a scholar in Germany now, has argued that part of the reason that Haizi is so kind of officially beloved is that he is from that era. He has kind of all of the magic of that era, but he's not tainted by the political problems of that era.
Most of the poets who survived that era had to go on and deal with the legacy of the post-Tiananmen Square China.
Yeah.
In various ways. Some of them fled. Some of them stopped writing poetry. Some of them started writing things that were more commercial. Some of them kept writing what they had been writing, but there wasn't the same sense of urgency to it. Not of the writing, but the way it was received. because the atmosphere in the 1980s was very much we are on the brink of something huge here. We are on the brink of having democracy, of having free speech, and all of this.
Haizi is reading Hegel. He's reading English and German Romantic poets. These are guys who English literature majors in America don't know about, and these guys know them backwards and forward. Not just Haizi, but other people who are kind of running in his group.
And it's
a time that's very open to foreign
It's extremely
ideas.
open to foreign, not completely, but compared to previous eras, very, very open.
Compared to modern China.
Even compared possibly now.
Compared to today's China.
Because there's not just we can find this stuff if we want. There's this stuff matters. Like, we are literally using this stuff to change the way people read, to change the way literature is done in China.
It kind of reminds me of the sort of late Qing.
Yeah. The late Qing and no, I was going to say the May 4th, but you're right, really the late Qing, because this is where all of the materials they're getting in, they mean something more than, that was a nice poem. It's powerful.
Again, I think one of the things that's so interesting about this era is the power of translation.
Mm-hmm.
That's something that strikes me.
And in fact, I would argue that one of the things that defines modern China, like if you want to sort of put date things into eras, is translation. Because this is one of the first times in history when you could effectively read multiple different kinds of foreign literature without even leaving your city. In almost every other era, people had to go to England or France or Russia or Japan.
Or at least Beijing and Shanghai.
Or at least Beijing and Shanghai. Here in the 1980s, you can effectively pick up a copy of Hegel. This isn't to say you can stroll to your corner store and buy it, but you can get it. I don't believe Haizi spoke foreign languages. I don't recall reading that anywhere. It's possible, but I don't think he did. So all of the stuff he's getting in translation without leaving China. And so it's that kind of era, and a lot of these materials you can still, in fact, you can find way more in China than you ever have been able to in the past. But
no one's reading them.
The post Tiananmen Square phase. I remember talking to professors in China about this, who were there, not literally in the square, but they were around for all of this, and they said everything changed after that. They said afterwards, it was literally like this incredible movement, and all of the stuff it represented was just gone. And you said, well, I guess it doesn't pay to be idealistic or anything like that anymore, so I suppose we'll just get jobs. I don't know. What do we do? And so it's very, like, literature doesn't have the same sort of revolutionary, almost cachet that it did then. And I think that's one of the reasons why Haizi is so, because he lives this stuff and dies at his own hand, which is, depending on your sort of reading of romantic literature, the ultimate gesture of control.
It's a very romantic death. How does he die?
He lays down on the railroad tracks, and he has a couple of books next to him. One is the Bible. One is, I can't remember.
A couple of books.
It's a couple of books. I remember one of them being somewhat random, like a copy of Conrad or something like that. And they found him there. And we should jump into the poem now, because this is an interesting, having said that he killed himself at the age of 25. He wrote poetry for 6 years. You would think, wow, this is one of his final poems. It's really going to be bleak.
Yeah.
But it's far from bleak. It's
really optimistic, to be honest. And in fact, the reading of the poem in China is incredibly optimistic.
Yeah.
So
the title, which is Mian Chao Da Hai, Chun Wan Hua Kai, we translate it as Facing the Sea. And you can translate it as either the spring is warm and flowers bloom, or you can take the verb out and just say the warm spring, the blooming flowers. That's a wonderful image. It's lovely. And it could...
What do you think... So facing the sea, what makes that lovely?
For me, one of the things that makes it lovely, and one of the reasons it's such an interesting image, is that the sea is one of those symbols of endlessness, because you can't see the other side. And if you're in China facing the sea, you're also facing other lands, other countries and cultures.
You're
and people.
Open to those outside ideas.
Yeah. But without really the belief that you'll ever have them, you'll ever attain them or reach them or experience them. And even the Chinese mian chao, which is facing towards the sea. He's not even watching the sea, looking at the sea, he's facing it. As in his entire bodily orientation is towards this endless thing and whatever is on the other side that he can't even see. There's a lot of that quality actually in his poetry of this sort of wistful yearning for something that he knows he can't have. He has, for example, a lot of poems dedicated to artists and writers from other eras. He has a poem dedicated to Kafka, a poem dedicated to Van Gogh, a poem dedicated to Victor Hugo, to Jesus, to a lot of different people. And they're never elegies or poems praising this person. They're very bizarre sort of meditations on the things that he saw in their work. Very much as though he's facing their work, not actually reading it. He's just sort of oriented towards it. When you read an image like facing the sea, what strikes you?
I don't know. I can't help but go with a semi-biographical reading. And although this poem in China is kind of treated as a beach poem, like a very the
beach poem sounds like it's like 60s pop music, like it's the beach poem.
Let's do the listener can't see me making my silly dance.
You were doing the surfing, that sort of swimmer dance they do.
No, but it does seem kind of like summer reading in a certain way. You know, like the images that you see when you search for this poem are often very bright. They're on the beach. You know, the one on Baidu that we were looking at has, I believe, a coconut.
It looked like it could be on the back of a Jimmy Buffett album. Frankly.
Yeah, exactly. It feels like a Jimmy Buffett poem.
Yeah.
A very serious Jimmy Buffett poem.
I want to point out, I'm willing to bet you will never, on any online site or in any print journal, see a connection made between Haizi and Jimmy Buffett. We've done it here
exclusive
to the Chinese
Literature
Podcast. We're going to copyright it.
But so there's this very Jimmy Buffett reading of the poem that I think is interesting because when you think about it biographically, as we've already mentioned, you know, he dances with a train a month or two after this. It's not a happy poem. And when you think about the imagery, I mean, sure, you could see like guy on the beach, toes in the sand, looking towards the ocean. But you mentioned the word endless as kind of what the ocean stood for, and that's I guess, positive thing. But there's also a negative reading of that. Like, death is also endless. It's one of those things. And I read this poem as a poem about death, a poem contemplating death, which maybe I'm too influenced by biography, and maybe that's something that I shouldn't do, but I just can't help it. It's such a... And when you start to see the ocean not as this, like, happy place where you go for your margaritas or whatever Jimmy Buffett does, it's a place that is, like, confronting you with the, like, tininess of your existence.
Yeah, your insignificance.
And you realize that you are going to expire and stuff is going to go away. That's really sad.
Well, and what's interesting, though, is that a lot of the other images in this poem are of a kind of endlessness of existence. He talks about wandering the entire world and seeing things that are beyond him, as though, like you were saying, he's contemplating, when I die, I can do anything. I'll be everywhere. It's like,
I don't know. I mean, like, I think that's one way to read it, but another way is, like, it's a very hopeful poem talking about what he's going to do. So the first line is, from tomorrow I will be a fortunate person, something like that.
A person with good fortune.
Yeah. And so it seems very kind of optimistic. And then he says, I'm going to feed my horses, I'm going to collect the firewood, I'm going to travel all around the world. And it's talking about all these things that he is going to do. And I think that lends itself to the Jimmy Buffett reading. But you're right, it's what he's doing when he's dead. It's an elegy. It's talking about how he deals with death.
But if that's the case, what he's contemplating occurring after death is incredibly, it's wonderful. Why would you not want to travel the world and there's a line. I'll just kind of translate these as a group, but where he says, "From tomorrow, I will share with all of those dear to me and tell them of my good fortune and of what the lightning of that fortune told me. I will tell every person and give each river, each mountain a new, warm name." It's hard to read those lines as being very, very sad. If in fact he is writing about death, and this is something that I've always thought about when reading Haizi, because when you talk with Chinese scholars about Haizi, they all explain his life as being extremely unhappy and miserable and poor, and biographically that's probably true. But if that's the case, why write a poem like this about death? Because it's like he's not looking at the act of dying, but the entire poem is dedicated to whatever's after it, which, to give each river and each mountain a new warm name, it's very hard to read that as dark.
But I guess I would say we have to go back to the beginning of the poem. He's facing the ocean. Mm-hmm. So his back is to those mountains and to those rivers.
Unless he's imagining mountains beyond the ocean that he's going to go to, because he's wandering, he says, the whole world. And things like warm spring, blooming flowers, that's everywhere. I mean,
it's not in the ocean.
Not in the ocean, but if he's facing the ocean, is he literally just, I'm looking at the water and that's it? There's always a sense of what you're looking at is not just the ocean, but distance.
But hasn't he turned his back on all those things? Hasn't he turned his back on the mountains and the rivers and the flowers? Like, literally turned his back. He's not looking at anything. He's looking at this kind of flat endlessness.
Except here, he says, and give each river, each mountain, a new warm name. So
after he's gone, after he's not looking at them.
Well, this is there's no line here where he says, I'm looking at the mountains, or I've turned. There's no physical orientation here. And in fact,
there is. He says he's facing it.
But from where? Like, why do we assume he's facing the ocean in his hometown where he's always been?
Because that's what the word means. It's facing.
Facing the ocean. But you could face the ocean from Argentina. You could face the ocean from Alaska. You could face it from Greenland. And when you read Haizi's poetry, in this poem especially, there's no language saying, in the place where I grew up, next to the mountain, etc., etc. He uses very general language and often imagines himself in places that are far distant from where he was. So the typical reading of this poem is to imagine him on the coast, not far from Beijing, perhaps in the Shandong coast somewhere, looking out at the ocean from China. But this is someone who wrote elegies to foreign writers and always imagined a sort of global reach for poetry. So I think it's not necessarily a good reading to say he must be, by virtue of the fact that he's Chinese, standing on the Chinese shore looking at the ocean. That's kind of my reading. So Lee was giving me that look a second ago, that sort of like, you're really reaching here.
But I think your interpretation is interesting. I'm more inclined towards I'm less inclined towards the Jimmy Buffett interpretation. I'm more inclined towards the Emily Dickinson.
Did you just call my interpretation the Jimmy Buffett interpretation?
I did. The Jimmy Buffett reading.
That's not fair. I've read more of his poetry than you have. Anyway, but
who said anything bad about Jimmy Buffett?
It's a good point. We just lost a lot of fans. All the parrot heads are like, man, this guy just insulted Jimmy Buffett. We're going to go listen to a different podcast.
We lost our one listener.
Yeah, we lost. That's not exactly a huge demographic for this kind of thing. But the reason that I mentioned that reading is that when I was writing about him in China, one of the things that struck me as interesting is that he's often held up by Chinese scholars and by popular readers of his poetry as sort of like the quintessential Chinese idealist. And it's important for a lot of them that he's identified as primarily as Chinese.
Why?
There are a lot of reasons.
Okay.
One of them being that he's simply seen as such a brilliant, experimental sort of mercurial spirit,
and therefore he has to be.
No, but if you have someone that brilliant and iconoclastic, also be Chinese. It's like it raises the entire tradition. Okay. But what's interesting as you read him is that, especially in his epic, long works, you don't frequently see that kind of identification. There's no self-conscious presentation by the poet of why it's so great that he's Chinese or what it means to be Chinese. Mm-hmm. There's a lot more global reach to his writing. He's invoking Percy Bysshe Shelley in the same line as he's invoking Qu Yuan. And they're not set at odds with each other. They just happen to sort of coexist on the same page because these are all his influences. These are all the people he was communing with. Mm. And so to read Haizi as, this is going to sound funny, as Chinese is also somewhat limiting because, yes, he wrote in Chinese. Yes, he was undeniably Chinese. But to define him as that, to sort of limit him just to that tradition, I would argue is not necessarily fair to his poetry as a whole.
Which plays into your reading of this as a more positive kind of poem. Mm-hmm. There's something very open about it. I mean, he talks about the flowers opening up. The ocean is definitely associated with foreignness, specifically Westerners. In fact, the word for Westerners originally was Yangren, or oceanic people, something like that.
Yeah, that's true.
So there's the sense that he's open to foreign ideas and ideals, which he certainly was. I'm more and more convinced by your kind of more optimistic. I think there is more space for an optimistic reading, whereas my pessimistic reading is not the only.
We're also somewhat limited in this discussion that I've literally spent years reading and thinking and writing about Haizi. Lee has not. So
I've thought about him some.
He's thought about it, but all that to say that if Lee's convinced, we should do another podcast after you've read a ton of his poetry and then see if we still agree. But no, Haizi's a fascinating poet, and one of the reasons why stuff like this matters if you're at all interested in China is that, in the 1980s especially, this was the catalyst. This kind of stuff was the catalyst for cultural change, mostly among the intellectuals, but it filtered down all through all strata of society. I mean, even now, you can be in a vegetable market, and if you mention Haizi, there will be people there who've read him.
I mean, he was picking vegetables, apparently.
He was. In his poem, he talks about picking vegetables, so he must be one of them.
Yeah.
So very worth reading, just as a window on the era, even.
Tell me something. There is this kind of reading of him in China as a sort of countryside rural poet. Do you buy that?
Well, I mean, he's definitely a countryside. He's from the countryside.
Yeah.
But
he's incredibly sophisticated. Yeah. And not to say that the countryside can't be sophisticated, as we're both from rural backgrounds, but sophistication is definitely something that's more associated with the urban environment. And he's writing in the city, right? Like his kind of intellectual awakening is
Beijing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. He was at Beida.
He was at Beida at 15. Yeah. He entered Beijing University at 15 and was teaching political science and law in Beijing at the age of 20.
Yeah. So just
the guy was a freaking genius.
Yeah.
But no, it's interesting because I read him about the way I would read someone like Faulkner. Was Faulkner a quote-unquote rural writer? Mm-hmm. If you could read As I Lay Dying and say, yeah, Faulkner was definitely a writer of the countryside, as though his primary concern was to depict the countryside, that's insane. I mean, As I Lay Dying is very bizarre and abstract, as is...
It's not really concerned with issues of rural.
It's talking about the countryside.
It's using the countryside as a kind of tableau.
Yeah, it's a platform for talking about other things. And, he's bringing to bear things like cubism on the countryside. And that really is. I mean, Haizi's poetry on the countryside and nature is very much like that. It's abstract and experimental. So to the extent that he grew up in the countryside, you could say that may be one of the reasons why he's interested in the images. But it's very dangerous to just say, oh, so he's a rural poet.
So you would say calling him a rural poet to a certain degree limits him?
Definitely. In the same sense that calling Faulkner a rural novelist or a southern novelist is limiting.
Do you think that he, in this poem, there is any relevance to that sense of ruralness? Is that even at play in this poem?
I don't know. I don't see it in this poem, simply because, as I say it, Dahai could be just the ocean in general. They talk about Dahai in classical language and philosophy, and it's not the Pacific Ocean. It's ocean is more of almost an abstract concept.
That's a good point. We don't even know where he is.
No. And that was kind of my point, is that if you begin with the assumption that he's a rural Chinese poet, then this poem must be read as someone literally standing on the coast of Shandong or somewhere looking at the Beihai. But if it's not, and if he's himself imagining any ocean anywhere, it changes very much how you read it.
It almost seems... So a lot of his other work is mythological, to say the least.
Almost, yeah.
This poem, it doesn't really have any mythological references, but I would suggest it has some mythological resonance. Not in that it's talking about mythology, but in the fact that it is really kind of... It's so empty of any specificity that we can almost read it as this mythological word. Would you say that's...
Almost, yeah. I think mythological is almost a good...
It's a little strong.
Well, it's a little strong, but, in the classical definition of the term, no, he's not mythological. In the popular reception of the term, it's a good way to read Haizi, because this is someone who's writing a lot about China, but in ways that...
Is he writing about China?
Well, in many places he is, not in this poem.
Okay.
In this poem, I guess we should limit ourselves to this poem. But here, there is a lot of room to read this poem as he's looking not at the ocean, the Pacific Ocean, from which he can see from his hometown, and just ocean. Just a symbol of endlessness with something else on the other side. I guess technically that would be endless if there's something on the other side. But he can't see the end, is what I'm saying.
Sure.
And so, yeah, I think that's probably a good word to use, mythological. There's very little physical basis for this. He talks about things that exist everywhere: feeding horses, chopping wood, traveling the world, naming mountains and rivers.
They may exist everywhere, but they're very simplistic images.
Yes.
And it's not clear
primal,
what's going
even,
on.
Yeah.
Primal.
And, the word you use, mythological, even, he's got a line in here where he says, and to give each river, each mountain a new, warm name.
Which is a very mythological act.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So he's in and outside of time. He's by the ocean and he's not. And this placelessness is all through his poetry.
I think one of the things that I find so incredible about this poem is how empty it is, and yet how much it allows us to sort of fill in the blanks.
Yeah.
It provides a foundation. And I think that's why we both really like this poem, but we also have two totally different readings of it.
Mm-hmm. And I think that's honestly the best place to sort of summarize why Haizi is still as well read as he is he presents these tableaus, these scenarios, where there's pretty much room for anyone there. I mean, you could be on this side of the ocean or that side. You could be looking at spring or not looking at spring. There's so many ways to read this, and they're all there. And it talks about such primal images that everybody can associate with, that there's almost endless ways into the poem.
So, on that note, I think we're going to call it quits.
Yeah.
So, you could either read this poem, and we'll post it on the website, with the Jimmy Buffett reading, or the Slit Your Wrist Emily Dickinson's reading.
The Sylvia Plath reading.
But either way, they're both acceptable.
Yes. So I'm Rob Moore.
And I'm Lee Moore.
This is the Chinese Literature Podcast.